All right, the election less than 2 weeks away now, and the candidates are focusing heavily on Florida, a battleground that is now a complete
Whoa, exactly.
Almost through the computer, almost smashed the set. Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Lee. You were just demonstrating.
What a toss-up looks like.
We get it. A brand new poll showing Donald Trump with a slight edge over Hillary Clinton in the Sunshine State. The margin is razor thin, but the numbers are what they are. Donald Trump is in Washington this hour for the opening of the Trump International Hotel. After spending 3 days barnstorming the state, Florida's 29 electoral votes are crucial to Mr. Trump's hopes for an upset victory come November 8th. Our senior national correspondent John Roberts was in Florida. Now he's with us live from the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. John?
Jana, good morning to you. If it's Wednesday, it must be D.C. And Donald Trump about to take the stage here at the old post office to talk about his latest accomplishment, which he says, and the paintings up there say it, is under budget and ahead of schedule, using that really as an illustration for how he would govern the country if he is fortunate enough to win the election on November the 8th. A lot of people are saying, well, why is Donald Trump taking any time off the campaign trail to come here to Washington to open a hotel? I count about 40 cameras here today, Jenna, and that is more cameras than are typically at one of his campaign events. He did spend the last 3 days in Florida. A lot of that was to get out the vote because Florida began early voting on Monday. A two-day tally that I made finds that Democrats are outpacing Republicans by about 30,000 votes, though it's impossible to know how any of those people voted. But at least registered Democrats versus registered Republicans, Democrats in the lead by about 30,000. But the Trump campaign, happy with where it is right now, pointing out that a lot of Republican counties have not yet started early voting, and they will toward the end of the week. They also like the results of that new Bloomberg poll you briefly referenced at the top, which shows Donald Trump with a 2-point lead in the Sunshine State, 45-43. One of the big themes that Trump was going over on his 3-day swing through Florida was Obamacare and the looming fiasco now that the Obama administration acknowledges that enrollees in Obamacare will be facing premium hikes in the double digits, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25%. And Donald Trump yesterday in Tallahassee reminded people what Jonathan Gruber from MIT, considered the architect of the Obamacare bill, said about it when he was writing it. Listen to this.
He said they could pass Obamacare because the stupidity of the American voter. The stupidity. He called the American voters stupid. The only stupidity with the stupidity, and you know that, and it is the stupidity of our politicians who rammed this monster down our throats, and it's going to get worse, and Hillary Clinton wants to keep it.
Now, reports out today that the Donald Trump campaign is going to stop fundraising for the campaign and for the RNC. Not exactly true. Donald Trump will not headline any more big money fundraisers, but after this evening, Hillary Clinton won't be doing that anymore. But the Trump campaign will continue to raise money for the campaign and for the RNC. Donald Trump Jr. will be out there. Reince Priebus will be out there. Of course, they still have a very robust online fundraising capability as well. So it's not like they've stopped raising money. After he opens the old post office today, a little bit after noon, Jenna, he'll be heading to Charlotte, where he'll give a policy speech. It's all about urban renewal and rebuilding. It's kind of the answer to what he's been saying so far about the inner cities, where he's saying, what have you got to lose? Vote for Donald Trump. Today, he will respond to his own challenge, saying, here's what you've got to gain. Jenna?
John, just a quick question for you. You mentioned that there's more cameras at this event today than what would be considered a regular campaign event. Do you have any idea why that is? Is it simply because it's Washington, D.C., there's more attention on the hotel? Is it because there's been more criticism of this event? What do you think that's all about?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's in Washington, D.C. There's also a large contingent of international journalists here as well that we typically don't see on the road with Donald Trump. Many of them are based here in Washington, so it's kind of just down Pennsylvania Avenue, very easy to get to, which I think explains a lot of that, Jenna.
We'll be watching. John, thank you very much.
So the tight race in Florida has Mrs. Clinton campaigning there this morning, kicking off a 2-day swing with an organizing event this hour. Donald Trump just spent 3 days in Florida. He'll be heading off to North Carolina this afternoon, where he trails Mrs. Clinton in the polls. Let's talk about it all with Josh Kraushaar, politics editor for the National Journal, Michael Warren, online editor for the Weekly Standard. Welcome to both of you. You'll probably both be happy when the next 2 weeks are over. Josh, so this new Bloomberg poll shows Donald Trump up by 2 points in Florida. What do you make of it?
It's certainly the best news the Trump campaign has gotten out of Florida, or frankly in any of these battleground states, in quite some time. And look, there's good news and bad news for Trump in Florida. On one hand, the polls show the race competitive, very close. But on the other hand, some of these early voting numbers are a little bit discouraging for Republicans, where Republicans held about a 5-point advantage in terms of these early ballots cast in the last presidential election. That margin is down to about 1 point as of now this year in this election. So.
Stop for just a second and tell viewers how that works, because your ballot, when you mail it in, doesn't say Democratic ballot, Republican ballot, does it?
That's right, John. It's registered Republicans versus registered Democrats. So what Trump campaign officials will say is that some of these older Democratic voters are actually voting for Trump. In fact, Trump is doing very well with seniors and a lot of voters in working class areas that traditionally voted Democratic. So we don't know exactly how these voters cast their ballots. But what Democrats are encouraged about is that their turnout machine, that their ground game is fairly strong in Florida. That's why Donald Trump was spending 3 days in the Sunshine State to try to get out the vote on the Republican side.
Michael, we all know the role that Florida played in the Bush versus Gore election in 2000. Is it a must-win state for Donald Trump?
Well, yeah, but it's not the only must-win. I mean, this is the problem that Donald Trump faces, is even if he is ahead and competitive in Florida, and even if he does win Florida, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average of polls and sort of divide up the states between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in terms of the leaners, and you're left with the toss-ups, Trump doesn't have to just win Florida. He also has to win North Carolina. He also has to win Nevada. He also has to win all of these other states, including states that generally vote Republican, like Arizona, Utah, Texas, where he's even in trouble there if you look at those poll averages. So he's really playing defense here. So yes, Florida is must win, but it's not the only one, and that's a big problem.
So he's gone from Florida, Josh, to North Carolina. How do his prospects look there?
Well, North Carolina is also a state where the polls are closing, and there were 2 polls that showed the race within the margin of error. But again, this is actually an interesting state because you do have a very conservative base in both North Carolina and also Florida as well. So what Trump is trying to do in these final couple weeks is get the Republican base out, get conservative voters to show up. He's got a tough map no matter what happens, but if he can't get conservatives to show up and vote for him, he'll have a lot more problems with the big picture.
Well, and he says, Michael, that there is just this sort of undeclared well of Trump support out there that is going to put him over the top in some of these elections. I guess witness the claims about the ballots in Florida that are being mailed in.
Yeah, I mean, he can claim that. We haven't seen any evidence of that. And if you look at sort of the past numbers for people who have been registered to vote and haven't voted, all these sort of things, even if Trump were to get every single person who would generally vote Republican to vote this time around, it still wouldn't be enough in a lot of these swing states, particularly when you look at the higher turnout rates among Hispanic voters in places like Florida, like Arizona, like Colorado, where those voters, Hispanic voters, haven't really played a role in past elections as big as they may play this time around. And that's a group that's voting heavily Democratic. So Trump, I think, is counting on a big turnout from that base, but I think Hillary Clinton also has an advantage as well.
He's off the campaign trail today to open his new hotel in Washington, Josh. A lot of political observers have thrown up their hands and said huge mistake. But as John Roberts pointed out, he's getting a lot of publicity there, getting 40 cameras in the room, and a lot of Americans are going to be paying attention, aren't they?
Yeah, he'll get a lot of free media attention, and that is a good thing for the Trump campaign. The more worrisome thing is the fact that while Trump is in D.C., his running mate Mike Pence is in Utah. These are not, D.C. and Utah are not swing states on the presidential map. I think a lot of Republican strategists would love to see Trump spending more time in Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the classic swing states when you only have 2 weeks left. But he certainly will have a chance to amplify his message, and a lot of people will be watching Trump today at the hotel.
One thing positive, I guess, about Florida for the Republican Party, Michael, is Marco Rubio's numbers and what that means for control of the Senate.
Yeah, that's right. And this is actually pretty consistent. in polls of Florida. Marco Rubio actually running ahead of Donald Trump with respect to their Democratic opponents. And so, look, this is something where I think is a bit of a bright spot for Republicans. Florida, as well as Ohio, that swing state where Rob Portman, the Republican, is doing well. But it's also a problem if Trump can't turn out those voters, and if he's spending time in D.C. and not in those swing states working on Republican turnout, even those Republicans who are running ahead of Donald Trump are going to face a problem with depressed turnout. So they really need Republicans to come out to vote. And I think if I'm a Republican Senate candidate, I see this event in D.C. today, and I'm a little worried.
Michael Warren, Weekly Standard. Josh Kraushaar from the National Journal. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Well, as we hit the home stretch of the 2016 election, a column in the Wall Street Journal titled "My Former Republican Party is Worth Some Attention." Bret Stephens writes this, saying, quote, "I don't see the point of belonging to a party on the increasingly dubious assumption that it's slightly less bad than the opposition. If I can't get my grand old party back, I'd rather help build a new one." Joining me now, Bret Stephens, foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal. How is my impersonation of your? Is that not bad? Is not bad? Okay. How did you reach this conclusion?
Well, with a lot of misgiving and reluctance. But I kept thinking about where the Republican Party was just a few years ago, even when Mitt Romney was running for president, to say nothing of what it was when Ronald Reagan was president, and where it is today on immigration, on trade, on foreign policy, on a lot of issues that really matter to me. And it's a party I no longer recognize. When I was growing up, my parents used to say, we didn't leave the Democratic Party left us, with George McGovern and Jimmy Carter. And I more or less feel the same way now about the Republicans.
So at this moment, do you not consider yourself a Republican?
Well, I'm a registered Republican, and I'd like to see my old party back. I'd like, hopefully, after the election, I'd like to see the party be the party that stands for free trade, the party that understands the value of immigration for the United States, legal immigration for the United States, party that understands the importance of a strong defense, and above all, a party that insists on civility and culture in its leaders. And that's not what we have now.
So as a registered Republican, who are you voting for?
Well, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and I'm going to vote for Republicans down ballot. And I'm sure people are now currently throwing baseball bats through their TV screens.
Because it's one thing to say and be critical of your own party. It's another thing to say, well, I'm actually going to vote for the other party to be the leader of the free world.
Yeah, listen, I'm not enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. I can't count the number of columns I've written that are critical of Mrs. Clinton, but I actually think Donald Trump is a danger to the Republic, and I think the only way the Republican Party finds its center, finds its soul, finds its Reagan once again is if it takes such a drubbing that it says to itself, we're never going to repeat that mistake of nominating someone with the ideas or the temperament of Donald Trump.
But do you think in that case you're putting your party and your qualms with your party over the country, being that you've been so critical of Hillary Clinton, especially when it comes to foreign policy, which is your expertise?
No, listen, as I said, I think Donald Trump is a danger to the Republic. And, you know, look, God forbid we should take the man seriously when he says maybe he's not going to recognize the results of the election. At the end of the day, you have to take men at their word. That's why they're running for president. You can't vote for him on the assumption that he doesn't mean a word he says.
So another conservative columnist wrote a long piece just last week in the National Review, Victor Davis Hanson, about, and he was on our program, about basically towards a Republican like yourself who says, I can't vote for Donald Trump. And foreign policy was one of the things that he focused on. And I just want to read a little bit of his article. He said, President Trump might shake up U.S. foreign policy in controversial and not always polite ways. In far calmer fashion, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton already has revolutionized America's role overseas, from the Iraq pullout to the foundations of the Iran deal, to lead from behind Libyan bombing, to tiptoeing around violent extremism and workplace violence, to empowering Chinese expansionism, to increasing distance from allies and proximity to enemies. Obama reminded us that approval from abroad is usually synonymous with thanks for weakening America and making us more like them than us. I'm just wondering, I mean, that's a long list, Bret. Again, going back to your expertise of foreign policy, Hillary Clinton at the helm, you actually think we would be safer, even based on her record as mapped out in that piece, than a Donald Trump?
Yes, I do. I mean, look, as I said, if you've been reading my column for the last 7.5 years, I don't think I've had nary a kind word to say about Obama, except perhaps when bin Laden was killed. And you're absolutely right. Hillary Clinton was by his side on many of those decisions, although in truth she was also quietly opposed to some of the steps that he took. But as I said, Donald Trump is a danger to the Republic. When you have a senior Republican like Newt Gingrich saying, we might not defend NATO, our treaty ally, in the event that Russia invades it, you're sending a signal throughout our entire alliance system that our guarantees are not good. What does that mean in South China? What does that mean for a country like Israel? What does that mean for our small and embattled democratic allies abroad? That's the reason why he terrifies me.
Brett? Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for sharing our vote. We'll talk more about this.
Sorry about your TV sets.
We'd love to have you more next week as we get closer to the election. And we'll be right. What do you think about Brett? Let us know. We'll be right back with more happening now. Well, right now, automaker Volkswagen is preparing to begin buying back cars involved in its emission cheating scandal. The company is accused of rigging diesel engine vehicles to underreport emissions, and the $14.7 billion settlement is the largest in American history. It means 475,000 owners of Beetles and Golfs and Jettas and Passats can sell their cars back or get them modified and get cash compensation up to $10,000.
Some new information now in the Clinton email scandal. The latest email drop by WikiLeaks reveals Mrs. Clinton's campaign was scrambling to, quote, clean it up after President Obama denied any knowledge of the secretary's private server. Fox Business Network's Peter Barnes joins us live from Washington with that. Peter.
Well, hey, John, new emails from WikiLeaks show early concern by Hillary Clinton's aides over her email setup when she was at the State Department. President Obama was asked about it in March last year by Bill Plant of CBS News, 5 days after the New York Times reported Clinton's use of private email.
When did you first learn that Hillary Clinton used an email system outside the U.S. government for official business while she was Secretary of State?
At the same time, everybody else learned it through news reports.
The president's response made Clinton aides uneasy. Her speechwriter, Josh Schwerin, emailed communications director Jen Palmieri, quote, Jen, you probably have more on this, but it looks like POTUS just said he found out HRC was using her personal email when he saw it in the news. That email was then forwarded to other top Clinton aides, including Cheryl Mills, who responded, quote, we need to clean this up. He has emails from her. They do not say state.gov. On the night of the initial Times story, Democratic operative Neera Tanden emailed campaign chair John Podesta in disbelief. Tanden wrote, why didn't they get this stuff out like 18 months ago? So crazy. Podesta responded, unbelievable. Tanden followed up with, I guess I know the answer. They wanted to get away with it. Yesterday, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest maintained that the president did not know Clinton was using a private server. John?
Wow. Peter Barnes in Washington. Peter, thank you. America's election headquarters and the skyrocketing premiums for Obamacare. They could turn into a real vulnerability for Democrats as Donald Trump seizes on the issue on the campaign trail.
Repealing Obamacare and stopping Hillary's health care takeover is one of the single most important reasons that we must win on November 8th.
Joining us now for a little debate, Simon Rosenberg, president and founder of NDN and former Bill Clinton campaign advisor, and Morgan Ortegas, national co-chair of Maverick PAC and a former financial intelligence analyst for the Treasury Department. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Simon, as a loyal Democrat, are you worried that Obamacare is going to become a millstone for Democrats running? I mean, some of these premium announcements are coming out right before the election.
I think it's an issue, and I think we're going to have to address it. I mean, I think the particularly big problem is we just don't have a lot of time to rebut some of the more the exaggerated charges that we're going to hear. Let's be clear about what happened and what was announced, right? We're talking about 1.5 million to 2 million people who get their health insurance through the exchanges will see these galloping costs in their, hurt their own pocketbook. This is not affecting a bigger pool of people than that. And on balance, right, I think we can defend Obamacare. We've eliminated pre-existing conditions, lifetime caps. More than 20 million people have gotten insurance through Obamacare, and healthcare costs in in general, which is a big contributor to the deficit, have slowed down, and the growth of, so we can defend it over time, but I think, yes, there's an opportunity for the Republicans in this short window to make some gains in the next few weeks.
All right, Morgan, your response to some of Simon's points.
Well, good luck defending it. I think that this is a game changer, actually, for Republicans in tough Senate races, tough House races over the next 13 days. You know, it's easy to say what you've done with Obamacare, but go to the small business owner who can't hire more employees because they're worried about raising the number of employees they have to afford Obamacare. Go to the people whose premiums have risen. There's a reason why these insurers are dropping out of the marketplace. When you see the big guys leave the Obamacare marketplace, or when you see the premiums rising 25%, they're leaving, or the premiums are rising because costs are rising and the system doesn't work. We can go back to the inception of Obamacare, where the president jammed this through a Democrat-controlled Congress, and I don't think that they should be so surprised that Republicans aren't willing to lift a finger for a program that they find inherently flawed and bad for the American economy and bad for the small business owner.
If we are getting to the point where just one insurer is available to so many of these people, I mean, how do you fix that, Simon? It's not like you can go to Aetna or United Healthcare and say, hey, come back, well, let's try this again.
Yeah, look, there's no question that, in my mind, right, that on balance, Obamacare has been a success, right? This is a part of because Obamacare is much more than about the individual exchanges. It's eliminating pre-existing conditions. There's a lot that was in this, right? But this part of Obamacare is going to have to be fixed by the next Congress. It's an opportunity, frankly, for the two parties to work together to make sure that millions of Americans have a better health care system. Repealing it and replacing it is not an option. It will deny tens of millions of people who have insurance today, who've acquired it in the last few years. It will strip it from them. The Republicans are going to have to come to terms that their job now is to work with the Democrats to fix the system that's in place. And I think this is a great opportunity for Hillary Clinton and Paul Ryan to come together to work on something out of the box early next year.
Morgan, do you see that prospect? I mean, Obamacare, I don't think, got a single Republican vote when it was passed.
No, because there was no bipartisan consensus in trying to pass it in the first place. We have to see, of course, what happens in the Senate. Hillary Clinton in many polls is ahead. Of course, Mr. Trump would argue that he's ahead. But when you look at these close Senate races, the Republicans are being vastly outspent and outworked in the ground game in many ways. But the American electorate are still keeping these Senate races close. Why is that? That is because that the American people are not willing to give Hillary Clinton a mandate, and they're not willing to say that the game is over just yet. So a lot of it, again, lies what happens in the Senate. Republicans and Democrats will have to come to the table, but the primary lesson of how this flawed and failed bill was passed 8 years ago, I guess at this point, goes to show why people do actually have to work together, because now we have a bill that doesn't work with anybody. You could argue on balance it's better for, a certain number of people, but that just doesn't resonate with the small business owner right now watching Fox News who says, I can't hire 2 more people because I can't afford the regulatory costs. This is where Washington gets out of touch with everyday American lives.
Small business startups over the last 8 years have been abysmally low, Simon. Is this part of the reason, or is there something else afoot?
Well, the White House put out a major study about that issue yesterday, and I think this is going to be an area of significant discussion and debate in the coming years. But let's be clear, right? The economy is far better today than when Barack Obama took office, and even after the ACA is passed, we've seen now 4 consecutive years of significant increases in incomes and wages. We've seen the unemployment rate under 5%. We've seen a soaring stock market. So all the doom and gloom that we heard from the Republicans about how the ACA was going to be a job killer, it simply wasn't true. It's not true, right? And the economy is actually far better off today. A recent Bloomberg poll, only 28% of Americans said that the economy is worse off today than when Obama took office. The Republican narrative on this stuff is just wrong and out of touch with the American people.
John, you know what? John, if it's such a great system, then why are all the insurers dropping out of it?
There are issues. Listen, I said, right? There are things that have worked really well. There are things that are going to have to be addressed. Like what
exactly has worked well?
I think I already went through all this, right? And I guess you weren't listening, right?
We're about to launch the discussion all over again.
But the American people are listening, and they're going to be voting on this in the next 13 days. So watch for that. It's not a winner for you guys.
All right. Morgan Ortega, Simon Rosenberg, good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, some shocking details coming to light about a nurse accused of murdering 8 elderly patients. We've got the breaking details on that. Plus, as Hillary Clinton weathers a constant firestorm surrounding the WikiLeaks emails, our next guest says it's par for the course, but we'll talk about whether or not there's any legal issues next.
A nurse is facing murder charges in Canada now, allegedly after poisoning 8 patients at 2 assisted living facilities in Ontario. Elizabeth Wetlaufer allegedly carried out those crimes between 2007 and 2014. The victims ranged from 75 to 90 years of age. There's no word on a motive, but facility operators are cooperating with investigators as they look into what happened there.
Hillary Clinton copes with a constant drip of emails from WikiLeaks, and just this morning, the 19th group of WikiLeaks documents came out. We're already learning some new things, including that Clinton advisors were batting around how to deal with the server revelation 3 days before Clinton addressed the media at the UN about it. One of those advisors admitted there's no good way or good answer. We just need to gut through the process phase, get them all out there, and let the content do the talking. It's just one of a slew of new revelations we're going to talk about with Greg Jarrett, Fox News anchor and attorney. So, I mean, the sheer volume of these WikiLeaks emails, Greg, is a lot to go through. From what you've been looking at, I know you wrote a great opinion piece as well on FoxNews.com. Is there anything that is illegal so far? Any sort of red alert that you see from these batches?
Not from what I see. Hillary Clinton has a tendency to sort of stretch the bounds of propriety. She sometimes dangles her leg over the line of legality versus illegality. And it's sort of this, she beckons this continuous political calamity. It's one incident after another, and this is another example of it, and it's taking a toll. Look, 67% of the people think that she's lying about her personal emails, and 2/3 of Americans think she is dishonest. The normal person who kind of gets caught up in a scandal dials it back and stops. Not with Hillary Clinton, sort of like a runaway train that can't apply the brakes.
Well, of course, and you do have these hacking, so that's only perpetuating this more and more. One of the big news items of the week I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about is an ally, a very important Clinton ally, giving money to the wife of an official at the FBI.
Right.
Now, we hear from the Clinton camp and from Clinton surrogates. There's nothing illegal about that. But walk us through this, Greg, and why it's raising red flags.
Terry McAuliffe, governor of Virginia, longtime fundraiser for Hillary and Bill Clinton. In fact, he's the guy that secured the personal loan on their 11-room mansion in Chappaqua. Personally secured it. This is a guy who can raise, without breaking a sweat, hundreds of millions of dollars. So he engineers all of this cash to Dr. Jill McCabe, who's running for state senate in Virginia. Well, who's her husband? Andrew McCabe, who's the #2 guy at the FBI. He oversees the investigation of Hillary Clinton. Now, the FBI issued a statement saying, well, he didn't oversee the investigation until after her Senate campaign ended. My response is, so what? She still got the money. She's still beholden.
But there's nothing illegal about the money.
No, there is not.
It's just a large amount of money, we should mention.
But you have to look at who it goes to and who the husband is. Look, even the ethics advisors at the FBI told McCabe, you have to stay away and recuse yourself from any political corruption case.
Did he?
While your wife is running. He did. But as soon as his wife ended her campaign, he jumps in the biggest political corruption case of all, Hillary Clinton. It creates the appearance of impropriety, and indeed more than that, a very direct and glaring conflict of interest, and it taints the whole investigation.
And it raises some more questions about Comey,
the
head of the FBI, and some of the other decisions that he made. Walk us through that.
Well, I mean, look, you've already got 5 people who received immunity. You've got a whole bunch of others who took the 5th. Hillary Clinton, in an incredibly brief interview with the FBI, can't barely remember her name. I mean, it's really astonishing when you look at the notes from the FBI agents. So Comey holds, a few days later, this big briefing in which he lays out a case for gross negligence under the Espionage Act, and then in the same breath he says, but we're not going to recommend prosecution. Look, for people who thought that made no legal sense, and I was one of them as a lawyer, made no legal sense, this McAuliffe money to his deputy now only fuels suspicion that the fix was in.
So with this new information and with some ethical questions being raised, is there any recourse for the citizens that are watching this play out and wondering, well, wait a minute, do we need to readdress this because of some of the ethical questions that are coming?
If you feel like Director Comey was unduly influenced, or his deputy, Andrew McCabe, write to your senator, write to your congressman, and demand that Congress reactivate the independent counsel statute and undertake a separate and independent investigation of what Hillary Clinton did. You can always seek recourse, and Congress has the power to do it, and they could do it in a day by reactivating the old existing statute that expired.
Why didn't they do that?
Because there hasn't been enough pressure, I think, on Congress to do it. And they may get around to doing it eventually.
And as we just mentioned, a lot on recess as everyone is going towards the re-election campaign. So it might set up an interesting fall, regardless of what the election results are. Greg, thank you. Very interesting. Now to New Hampshire, another big swing state, where a new poll shows Hillary Clinton's lead is narrowing. A new Monmouth University poll puts Clinton at 46%. Donald Trump is 4 points behind at 42%. But it's notable that gap between Clinton and Trump was 9 points in September, and now it is closer. It comes as voters learn more about Obamacare premiums rising sharply next year, which could be a game changer. Potentially, Donald Trump's son, Eric, says Obamacare is simply not living up to its billing.
The problem is no one ever holds politicians accountable. You know, Obama promised a couple things. You're going to be able to keep your plan, you know, you're going to be able to keep your doctor, and that the average family was going to save $2,500 a year. The problem is you didn't get to keep your doctor, you didn't get to keep your plan, and the average family spends $4,500 more a year.
Luis Grodnowski is a health policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and it's great to have you today, Luis, as we take a look closer at the healthcare issue overall. Based on your reporting and your experience on this subject, how does this play politically for folks? Is it a huge motivator for people politically?
It can be. People's feelings about the health law tend to track pretty closely with their partisan affiliations, how they're feeling about the economy, and how they're feeling about the president. So for both parties, particularly Republicans at the moment, it's certainly a powerful issue to use to rally one's base. With undecided voters, like the country as a whole, people have contradictory views about the health law. They simultaneously don't like it, but they also don't want to repeal it. So for a politician who's appealing to those voters, they have to thread the needle pretty carefully.
A man described as the architect of Obamacare spoke on another network this morning, and he was defending what has been one of the big headlines of the week, which is the raise in premiums that a lot of consumers are going to see. The first part being that the raising of the premiums are harmless because of subsidies. Walk us through that. Is that true?
So there are about 10 million people right now who get coverage through healthcare.gov or a state equivalent. And of those people, around 80% of them get some sort of subsidy that offsets the cost of their premium. Those subsidies are tied to both their income and the cost of coverage in their area. So if the cost of coverage goes up, the value of their subsidy goes up too. But it's also important to remember there are about 9 million people who don't use healthcare.gov, most of whom are not eligible for subsidies, and another potentially 10 million people who could be getting coverage through healthcare.gov or through an insurer because they don't have access to it any other way. And those people don't get subsidies because their incomes are too high to qualify for them. So they feel the full impact.
So they'll feel the impact. The subsidies, for a moment, who pays for the subsidies?
So the subsidies are federally funded. The Obama administration has pointed out that because premiums came in lower than expected for the first couple of years, because insurers took a fairly optimistic and competitive approach to the new markets, there is some money left over for this adjustment year, except that there are a lot of people who don't think that it's going to be an adjustment year or that this is a one-time thing. The risk that they see is that if the rates go higher this year, they will further deter healthy people from signing up, which means that next year the rates can only go further, and the situation becomes self-compounding pretty quickly from there.
And when you say federally funded, I'm assuming that means taxpayer funded, because we fund the government?
That's right.
So even if you're receiving a subsidy, in another way, you could actually be paying for your own subsidy because you're a taxpayer.
Certainly. But again, as I said, the rates did come in lower than expected, so the question is now whether the subsidy has to continue to go up in the future.
And that's one of the games of the new healthcare law, and I apologize for the use of the game, but that's what we're watching it play out, how it's going to function, because these are moving numbers, and that's something we're seeing from health insurance companies, how they're placing costs, what we're actually paying. We heard Hillary Clinton talked a little bit about deductibles. So I also want to just zero in on whoever is the next president, what that means for this healthcare law and what modifications would have to be made. I know that's a big topic, Louise, but what do you think is at the top of that list?
So right now on the campaign trail, particularly as candidates talk to their bases, you're hearing a lot of ideas to change the law on fairly extreme polarized sides. People want to repeal it, people want a public option, people want to expand it in other ways. my guess is that when a closely divided Congress is elected, if that's the outcome of this election, regardless of who's in the White House, Republicans and Democrats are going to have to do something about health care they haven't had to do for 7 years. They're going to have to talk to each other. They're going to have to actually negotiate on what changes they could both agree on. And so the kind of changes you might expect there are going to be much more middle-of-the-road ones that can get bipartisan consensus.
One of the arguments in favor of Obamacare, and we've heard it on our own program, so I just want to flesh that out for our viewers a little bit, is the rising cost of health care would be so much worse if we did not have Obamacare. We've heard a few different Democrat surrogates tell us about that. Is that the truth?
It's hard to tell what would have happened without the law, and there are a lot of things that people attribute to the law that are not to do with the law, and a lot of things that are, but in ways that are more complicated than people can perhaps follow, because there's just a lot going on in healthcare. But, I mean, the law has certainly made sweeping changes to the way health insurance is priced and sold in the United States, especially for people who get it on their own. You can get it regardless of your medical history. That's a big change. And so sort of the impact of that change is likely to take years to discern.
And absolutely a fair point. You know, it seems that a lot of our more detailed conversations come back to these central tenets. Well, what about healthcare costs? What about our debt? What are we really doing to attack some of these problems? And just as we close up here, you know, because we've heard two polarizing potential solutions for healthcare and where it's going. We've heard from the Democrats at times, or critics of the Democrats, that that Obamacare is a setup that eventually will need a public option. We've heard from more conservative voices that what we really need to do is allow competition for health insurance companies across state lines. My question to you today is, could we actually do both? Is there a possible compromise with two of those things to bring them together that could help, which is already an issue that's very much a challenge in our country?
So both idea inflames the other side, and I think what seems more likely than anything else is that next year people will find themselves doing neither, and instead talking about more moderate changes to the health law, the kind of things that are backed by insurers. For example, conservatives would like to see the pricing structure of the health law changed if they can't overturn it, so that younger people are allowed to pay less, and older people in turn can be charged more, in line with what insurers think that they actually, cost in terms of claims. That's a conservative idea. A liberal idea is to expand the value of tax credits. In theory, both sides could could trade on these two things and reach some sort of compromise. But it's very different from the sort of things people are talking about right now, like a public option.
Yeah, of course, and we're in a different environment, being before Election Day. Louise, a personal thank you from me. It's so nice to be able to have a substantial conversation on such a big issue during a time when there's so much emotion. So we appreciate your expertise, and we look forward to having you back on the program. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So if Hillary Clinton does win the White House, could her victory present be a congressional investigation? Let's bring in Charlie Hurt, columnist for the Washington Times, and Betsy Woodruff, reporter for the Daily Beast. Even the public hasn't really had time to digest everything that's in these WikiLeaks emails, but you can be certain that congressional staffers are, Charlie. Are we looking at Clinton investigations if, in fact, she is elected?
Yeah, I mean, at this rate, I think we'll probably pick up with the Clintons right where we left off in 2000. With, endless investigations, endless inquiries. And what we're seeing from these WikiLeaks is that it's all justified. I mean, they really are as bad as everybody thinks they are. They really are as, dishonest and calculating as everybody insists they are. And of course, Hillary Clinton, tries to brush it off as, oh, it's just a vast right-wing conspiracy. Well, the only conspiracy, it's all being, the whole roadmap is being laid out before us.
Betsy, Jason Chaffetz was on Fox News last week, the Republican congressman from Utah. He said that just the quid pro quo email alone, the one that suggested the FBI was maybe going to be offered some cushy jobs in exchange for going easy on the Benghazi situation. He said that email alone was worth 4 congressional investigations, and there have been revelations since then.
I thought that email was one of the most galling of the emails that have been released, of course, because one of the challenges, I think, for Republicans going after Hillary Clinton based on the information in these emails is that it's really difficult, and thus far they haven't had a lot of success proving that she particularly was able to get foreign governments or members of the U.S. government to specifically do favors for her or for her allies in exchange for her doing favors for them, which there's just basically no evidence of specific, explicit quid pro quos. However, of course, that email that even uses the term quid pro quo, that's kind of a game changer. That's a really important one. Now, another thing that stood out to me about these emails is that it shows there's a lot of dissent within the Clinton camp about how to handle the entire controversy, going all the way back to March of 2015 when the news first really broke that she'd used a private email account to do State Department business. We see Clinton allies in the more the campaign side just ripping into folks who are close to Clinton at the State Department. In one email, Neera Tanden mentioned earlier, said that she thought the State Department folks, or appears to say in this email, she thought the State Department folks handled the scandal in the way they did because they wanted to get away with it. Now, of course, we don't always have full context for these email conversations. The Clinton campaign isn't confirming or denying the validity of what's in these communications. But yeah, absolutely, we can expect Republicans to be digging into this stuff for years to come.
Her problem ahead, if she wins, Charlie, won't necessarily come from the right either solely. I mean, Bernie Sanders is saying he's going to be watching her like a hawk. And a lot of her fundraising comes from Wall Street types.
Yeah, and what's being revealed in these WikiLeaks is not just shocking to Republicans, but it's also shocking to that whole wing of the Democratic Party that supported Bernie Sanders and didn't want Clinton in the first place. And one of the big reasons for that is exactly what is being revealed here. But another thing that I think is very important, John, is the fact that there are we're just scratching the surface. I mean, the number of emails we're talking about here, it's going to take a long time before. I suspect there are numerous bombshells in here that we're just not even sort of getting to yet, that we haven't connected the dots on yet. And it's going to take a good couple of years to get through all of this.
And there are more coming. More every single day. All right, Charlie Hurt, Betsy Woodruff, thank you both.
Thanks,
and we're
John.
back with more happening now in just a moment.
A Fox News alert, and we like to continue to bring to your attention a Russia on the move. And one of the things that we've just confirmed now is that the Russian armada that we've been following, 7 ships, including an aircraft carrier, have now entered the Mediterranean. And the goals, apparently, of this flotilla is to have bombing missions inside Syria on behalf of President Assad. Of course, we've been at odds with Russia about what they're doing and whether or not it's actually harming innocent Syrians on the ground there. But the show of force is significant. It's significant because it is 7 ships and because it shows that Russia is not backing down. Also, just want to mention this, Russia has sent other ships to Cuba. So you can see Russia definitely putting it out there that Russia is on the move and continues to be aggressive, especially when it comes to its partnership with Assad in Syria. As we all know, the next commander-in-chief will be handling this issue, whoever they are. And Brett Barry is going to take a look at this topic and others on October 29th. It's called How We Fight, and it premieres this Saturday, 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Right here on the Fox News channel. In the meantime, we want to get to this Fox News alert. This just crossing our desk right now that there's been a powerful earthquake in Italy. The initial reading is of a 5.6, and that's in the central area of Italy near Perugia. That, just for a point of reference, is north of Rome. It's also north of Amatrice, which is the area where there was that devastating earthquake just about 2 months ago. But according to the reports that we're getting into our newsroom, that magnitude 5.6 earthquake was felt in Rome, which indicates that it's a fairly good shaker. From my own experience growing up in San Francisco, being through several powerful earthquakes, this is enough to definitely wake you up and get you moving. Our Rome Bureau is covering this story. As we get more information, we'll bring it to you.
Some new developments in America's election headquarters to bring you, with word Donald Trump is scaling back on transition efforts, reportedly asking his campaign to reduce its work identifying candidates for key jobs in a Trump administration and instead focus on boosting his chances on Election Day. This, as the Washington Post reports, a top super PAC backing Hillary Clinton just raised nearly $175 million, and that is a new record for any super PAC. Joining us now, Mercedes Schlapp, Fox News contributor and former White House spokeswoman for Spanish language media under President Bush, and Matthew Littman, a former speechwriter for Joe Biden. I want to get your take first, Mercedes, on this report that Trump's people, that Donald Trump has asked his people to reduce the transition efforts and instead focus on winning the election. I suppose it makes sense because you're not going to have a transition team if you don't win the election.
Well, you know, I think you want to have all hands on deck, especially in these last 2 weeks of the campaign. I can tell you, working on 2 presidential campaigns, that the get out, the vote efforts are critically important, especially in the last 72 hours. And so you want to get all your talent. You want to get your foot soldiers all on these battleground states to ensure that the absentee ballots are being picked up, that individuals are being able to get to the voting booths. I mean, I think the ground game at this point is incredibly important. And I know that the RNC has built out their ground game for over a year and has put, you know, key people in place. So if I were a campaign, absolutely I would move and focus 100% at this point on ensuring that we have the best ground game in these different battleground states and ensure that we have the best talent there
Matthew,
as well.
do you see it differently from the Democratic perspective?
Well, first of all, it's always hard to disagree with Mercedes because she's so jovial and it makes me want to agree with her, but I have to disagree with her. The reason why Trump is doing this is because he's losing, and he's losing pretty badly, and he's losing in most of the swing states. He's still down double digits in Pennsylvania. He's down in North Carolina. So for Trump to move his money from transition to ground game, they haven't invested. Mercedes is artfully saying the RNC is invested in the ground game. The Trump campaign has not. The Hillary campaign has invested in it, has a much stronger ground game than the Trump campaign. So I would say Hillary's up by about an average of 6 points in most of the polls now. Nationally, I would say that could be 7 or 8 points by the time we get to voting day.
Washington. Well, go ahead, Mercedes.
Clearly, and Matt, I think you're incredibly charming as well, but I think clearly the point here is that, yeah, Trump's the underdog. He's a people's candidate. He's willing to take on this fight. He's going to go into these battleground states, and you just saw a poll today in Florida from Bloomberg Politics that he's up by 2. I was down in Florida yesterday. There's a sense of enthusiasm that's swelling in that state. I think in North Carolina as well. I think this is going to start getting tighter as we see these poll numbers. And if he can get it down to a margin of 2%, he's totally in the game. He could win this thing.
I want to.
Okay, but Mercedes, Trump. When you say that Trump is up by 2 in a poll in Florida today, he's also down by 3 in a poll in Florida today. And Trump, that's going to be a very close race in Florida. There's no doubt about it.
And
but
in North Carolina
when you say that Trump is the people, when you say Trump is the people's candidate, let's remember right now the people are rejecting Donald Trump, and he had a chance. He had 3 debates. He had a chance in those debates. Remember, he lost all 3 debates. That's a very difficult thing to do, and he managed to go 0 for 3.
The race does seem to be getting tighter, though, in these last less than 2 weeks, Matt.
Well, I don't think in some states it is. In New Hampshire, it looks like it's a little tighter. In Florida, it's been tight all along. But Hillary's ahead by so far in some of these other states that used to be swing states. Pennsylvania is not really a swing state anymore. Colorado, not a swing state. Virginia, not a swing state. Without Pennsylvania, for example, Trump has no way to win. So let's not trick the audience into thinking something's going to happen here that's not. There is no path right now for Donald Trump.
One of the stories just out yesterday in the Washington Post, Mercedes, is that he had stopped essentially doing big dollar fundraisers to bring money into the Republican National Committee. John Roberts said that's not that unusual, that Hillary Clinton isn't doing big dollar fundraisers for the DNC between now and Election Day either. Which is it?
Well, Governor Pence is holding a fundraiser today. There's another one tomorrow that he will be at. The fundraising hasn't slowed down. Now, here's the reality. When you look at Governor Romney, for example, he stopped fundraising back in October 12th, back in 2012. At this point with the money game, you got to spend the money that you have. You spend it in the get out the vote efforts, in the infrastructure. You're doing the TV ads, although this time around the TV ads don't seem to be effective because, as we know, Hillary Clinton has been outspending Trump time and time again, and this poor lady can't seem to get over 50% hardly anywhere. So I think that for the most part, at this point, they've got to spend the money that they've got, and I think that goes for both campaigns.
I'm sure that Matt.
Well, John, I have to react to that because Mercedes is saying that Donald Trump that Hillary doesn't have 50%. She's winning in all of the polls. Donald Trump is down at about 37, 38%.
She can't break
42% of the country is Republican. Hang on for 1 second, Mercedes. Hang on for 1 second. Hang on for 1 second, Mercedes.
She's spending so
there are
much
42%
money,
of the Republicans.
able to break 50%. Think about that.
Let him answer, Matt. Okay, go ahead, Matt.
I'm thinking about it. She's winning. There are 4 people in the race. Hillary is beating Trump by an average of 6 points. Trump can't break 40%.
Well,
first of all, I think it's more like 4%. I think as we focus on the issues like premium increases skyrocketing from Obamacare, which translate clearly into Hillary care, if we're able to focus on these kitchen table issues, Donald Trump is a winner on that, because at the end, people don't like Hillary Clinton, and the fact is that they don't like her agenda. But the Democrats have done, to the Democrats' advantage, just continue on the distraction on other things that don't have to deal with the issues that Americans care about.
Last thought, Matt.
When Donald Trump talks about his first 100 days and says he's going to sue all of these women, is that focusing on the issues? Donald Trump hasn't been able to focus on the issues for 1 day. It's Donald Trump who's the distraction for his campaign, not anybody else.
It started out so friendly. We hope you guys are still admirers.
We'll be friends after this, I
Matthew
promise.
Littman, Mercedes Schlapp, thank you both.
Thank you, John.
This is quite a story. 3 women are now facing theft charges for reportedly stealing nearly 40 Donald Trump signs along a road in Maine. One of the women admitted to taking the signs in an op-ed in the Washington Post. 52-year-old Betta Stoddard writes that she's not the law-breaking type, but Trump's talk about women pushed her over the edge. It reads, quote, reflecting back, I realized that I momentarily snapped, but there was a deeper reason for my anger than just the signs. Over the past several weeks, grasping the depth of Trump's predatory behavior towards women throughout his adult life, and even worse, his denial of it, has simply become unbearable. I became unhinged. Brian Claypool is a criminal defense attorney. Bob Bianchi is a criminal defense attorney, former head county prosecutor, trial attorney. I gave it a little drama because I felt like I needed it. I think that's what she would say. The question is whether or not it's legal. So let me just, for our viewers who did not actually read this column, the cops stopped these 3 moms on the side of the road in their Jetta, where they had the signs in the back. And he's like, what are you doing? They explain. He says, you can't do that. He takes the signs. And the next day he goes to this woman's house and says, listen, the guy who owned the signs is pressing charges against you. And here's your day in court. Bob, does the owner of the signs have a case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but we have to use the rule of reason and be a little tempered with this. There is no question about the fact these signs are expensive. In fact, it's property. It was stolen or destroyed. So it clearly is a crime, a very minor crime. But as a former county prosecutor, I can tell you I was in charge of elections, and this sign stealing thing goes on all the time. I remember one time when they took a bunch of Democratic signs and put it on Planned Parenthood's lawn. So look, you got these soccer moms in this car, the getaway car, they do this. Listen,
is it dead of night, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, is it prosecutable? Yes, but I think the prosecutor is going to be reasonable with this.
Wait a minute, Bob, let me just, because you have experience with this, I have to ask you, we're seeing some file video. She describes the signs as being alongside what is comparable to Main Street. And so the median, she was explaining it as, these are on the side of the road. Does it matter where the signs are placed? And if it's in a public area where no one necessarily owns that piece of the road, does that mean it's fair game, or is it still protected property?
It's still protected property. Listen, if anybody has a problem out there with these signs or something that they think is inappropriate, the response is to call the law enforcement authorities and let them take that. You just don't destroy the signs and take them. And let's face it, they told you that they did this for a different reason. I mean, part of it was where they were placed, but the other part of it was that they became unhinged because of Donald Trump. Well, it's a crime.
I'm curious, Brian, she felt assaulted by the sheer number of signs. That's part of her defense in this op-ed. What about that argument, Brian?
Well, Jenna, I'm kind of wondering whether there's going to be a WikiLeaks email soon on the Hillary Clinton campaign putting her up to this, or possibly some surveillance video talking about that. And wait a minute, I mean, is the election rigged? Everybody made fun of Trump, but did somebody put her up to that? Let's assume that somebody didn't put her up from the Hillary Clinton campaign. She has a potential defense. I know it sounds kind of odd, but remember that Twinkie defense many years ago? But I would call this the Access Hollywood diminished capacity defense.
Wait.
This woman you're talking about, she had commented about how 10 years ago, 15 years ago, she was not assaulted by a donor, but she was flown around the country for sexual favors.
Okay, let me just
and
explain.
she felt
what
compelled.
She says is that this was a trigger for her because there was a man in a powerful position once who propositioned her. Nothing happened, and he kind of pulled it back, but she felt that it triggered her.
Yeah,
Right.
listen,
Well,
I like
right.
Brian. He's a great defense lawyer.
People are saying, well, why is Donald Trump taking any time off the campaign trail to come here to Washington to open a hotel? I count about 40 cameras here today, Jenna, and that is more cameras than are typically at one of his campaign events. He did spend the last 3 days in Florida. A lot of that was to get out the vote because Florida began early voting on Monday. A 2-day tally that I made finds that Democrats are outpacing Republicans by about 30,000 votes, though it's impossible to know how any of those people voted, but at least registered Democrats versus registered Republicans, Democrats in the lead by about 30,000. But the Trump campaign, happy with where it is right now, pointing out that a lot of Republican counties have not yet started early voting, and they will toward the end of the week. They also like the results of that new Bloomberg poll you briefly referenced at the top, which shows Donald Trump with a 2-point lead in the Sunshine State, 45-43. One of the big themes that Trump was going over on his 3-day swing through Florida was Obamacare and the looming fiasco now that the Obama administration acknowledges that enrollees in Obamacare will be facing premium hikes in the double digits, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25%. And Donald Trump yesterday in Tallahassee reminded people what Jonathan Gruber from MIT, considered the architect of the Obamacare bill, said about it when he was writing it. Listen to this.
He said they could pass Obamacare because the stupidity of the American voter. The stupidity. He called the American voter stupid. The only stupidity with the stupidity, and you know that, and it is the stupidity of our politicians who rammed this monster down our throats, and it's going to get worse, and Hillary Clinton wants to keep it.
Now, reports out today that the Donald Trump campaign is going to stop fundraising for the campaign and for the RNC. Not exactly true. Donald Trump will not headline any more big money fundraisers, but after this evening, Hillary Clinton won't be doing that anymore. But the Trump campaign will continue to raise money for the campaign and for the RNC. Donald Trump Jr. will be out there. Reince Priebus will be out there. Of course, they still have a very robust online fundraising capability as well. So it's not like they've stopped raising money. After he opens the old post office today, a little bit after noon, Jenna, he'll be heading to Charlotte, where he'll give a policy speech. It's all about urban renewal and rebuilding. It's kind of the answer to what he's been saying so far about the inner cities, where he's saying, what have you got to lose? Vote for Donald Trump. Today, he will respond to his own challenge, saying, here's what you've got to gain. Jenna?
John, just a quick question for you. You mentioned that there's more cameras at this event today than what would be considered a regular campaign event. Do you have any idea why that is? Is it simply because it's Washington, D.C., there's more attention on the hotel? Is it because there's been more criticism of this event? What do you think that's all about?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's in Washington, D.C. There's also a large contingent of international journalists here as well that we typically don't see on the road with Donald Trump. Many of them are based here in Washington, so it's kind of just down Pennsylvania Avenue, very easy to get to, which I think explains a lot of that. Jenna?
We'll be watching. John, thank you very much.
So the tight race in Florida has Mrs. Clinton campaigning there this morning, kicking off a 2-day swing with an organizing event this hour. Donald Trump just spent 3 days in Florida. He'll be heading off to North Carolina this afternoon, where he trails Mrs. Clinton in the polls. Let's talk about it all with Josh Kraushaar, politics editor for the National Journal, Michael Warren, online editor for the Weekly Standard. Welcome to both of you. You'll probably both be happy when the next 2 weeks are over. Josh, so this new Bloomberg poll shows Donald Trump up by 2 points in Florida. What do you make of it?
It's certainly the best news the Trump campaign has gotten out of.
All right, the election less than 2 weeks away now, and the candidates are focusing heavily on Florida, a battleground that is now a complete
Whoa, exactly.
Almost through the computer, almost smashed the set. Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Lee. You were just demonstrating.
Demonstrating what a toss-up looks like.
We get it. A brand new poll showing Donald Trump with a slight edge over Hillary Clinton in the Sunshine State. The margin is razor thin, but the numbers are what they are. Donald Trump is in Washington this hour for the opening of the Trump International Hotel. After spending 3 days barnstorming the state, Florida's 29 electoral votes are crucial to Mr. Trump's hopes for an upset victory come November 8th. Our senior national correspondent John Roberts was in Florida. Now he's with us live from the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. John?
Janet, good morning to you. If it's Wednesday, it must be D.C. And Donald Trump about to take the stage here at the old post office to talk about his latest accomplishment, which he says, and the paintings up there say it, is under budget and ahead of schedule, using that really as an illustration for how he would govern the country if he is fortunate enough to win the election on November the 8th. A lot of people,
Florida, or frankly in any of these battleground states, in quite some time. And look, there's good news and bad news for Trump in Florida. On one hand, the polls show the race competitive, very close. But on the other hand, some of these early voting numbers are a little bit discouraging for Republicans, where Republicans held about a 5-point advantage in terms of these early ballots cast in the last presidential election. That margin is down to about 1 point as of now this year in this election. So.
Stop for just a second and tell viewers how that works, because your ballot, when you mail it in, doesn't say Democratic ballot, Republican ballot, does it?
That's right, John. It's registered Republicans versus registered Democrats. So what Trump campaign officials will say is that some of these older Democratic voters are actually voting for Trump. In fact, Trump is doing very well with seniors and a lot of voters in working class areas that traditionally voted Democratic. So we don't know exactly how these voters cast their ballots. But what Democrats are encouraged about is that their turnout machine, that their ground game is fairly strong in Florida. That's why Donald Trump was spending 3 days in the Sunshine State to try to get out the vote on the Republican side.
Michael, we all know the role that Florida played in the Bush versus Gore election in 2000. Is it a must-win state for Donald Trump?
Well, yeah.